Look,
Errol.
Richard's pulling out his evidence. He's pulling out his evidence right there.
Yeah.
Hey, welcome to our Bucky weekend call for 11/23, 11/24. We're still haven't heard from Anne, although I think she said she might not be able to be with us this week. And John has sent a decline on his invitation. So it looks like we're the Three Musketeers unless someone else joins us. So, Richard, how are you feeling tonight? And what do you anticipate to get out of this call?
Well, I guess to be honest, I'm feeling snowed in or snowed on. We got a really big snowfall last night, and I was up early this morning pushing snow around. And but other than that, yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I always like to see dialogues about that involve, well, both Fuller and Amy Edmondson, partly because of knowing her story a long time ago and always being amazed at how she came out of her studies at Harvard and ended up working for Fuller in the last few years of his life. So it's, and I used her work to try and encourage students to pay more attention to Fuller's ideas and thinking, along with what I was trying to introduce to them as an application in my discipline. So it's really quite something to be back going through her work, and at the same time being able to follow what she's doing back at Harvard and the focus of her work now on things like organizational safety and learning from failures. So how are you feeling, Joe? And what's your takeaway or want to take away today?
You know, I enjoy going through this book as well. I mean, I think that what you know, this book does for me is it actually makes things, you know, really accessible. And then you can kind of apply Bucky's concepts to, you know, a number of areas, but even, you know, our previous discussion on language and words, Bucky's ideas about integrity with our words, you know, that the way she frames it and takes some of these more really complex ideas and actually makes them accessible. So this book is especially helpful to me. And yeah, no, I mean, having an opportunity, I think, even to have attended the psychological safety event this week, Amy talked a little bit about how she had come to Harvard back as a faculty member, and her background, you know, being both scientific, but being an organizational expert, and how that kind of made, you know, taking the more scientific approach, I would say, to organizational theory, it has been, I think, is something that really is unique. And so having both the geometric and Bucky's thinking, and as well as some of the understanding of organizational dynamics, is something that I very much appreciate. So it adds an intellectual rigor to the field, and that's something that I'm really interested in, is understanding how organizations essentially function, but how they're set up specifically to encourage and enable ideas to flourish. And that's obviously one of the ideas with Bucky, is that when you're coming up with new ideas and a new system, then you know, that's absolutely essential, because you want as many ideas on the table as possible in order to basically one, You have as many perspectives, but then two, you also have a more rich result of when everybody feels like, one, they're included, but also everybody's ideas are out there and you can pick the best ones. All right, so Steve, how do you feel? What do you want to take away from today?
Well, I'm got to tell you, I'm really grateful for this group. I love what I'm learning about systems and Bucky, and I love what I'm hearing about the way she explains things. And what's cool is the way Amy Edmonton is tying them into other sciences. So, like we hear about Bucky's definition of geometry as relating to Eddington and other people in science, and how she's interrelating everything. And that's pretty exciting to me. It helps me understand a little bit more about what's going on. We left off 2 weeks ago at the end of page 41, completing chapter 3. So we're now beginning chapter 4, tools of the trade. And that's what we will tackle now, if we'd like to do that.
Yeah, just let me say one other thing about Amy. I just realized as we were talking that next July 2025 will be 30 years since I first met her in a workshop at celebrating Fuller's 100th anniversary or 100th birthday anniversary in San Diego in 1995.
Wow. It's really cool that you've had all this experience with her in your profession, what you've done with Bucky, and then meeting all these people and having classes with these people and having all the interaction sure gives some depth to this call.
Yeah.
We're grateful for that. Cool. So with all that in mind, I need to, I'm one step behind in pulling up my my stuff here. So give me a second and I'll pull it up, because I'd like to be able to here we go. And then hopefully this will open up to yep, there it is, page 41. And so now here we are beginning tools of the trade. Okay. And I really like rotating reading around. Who wants to read first?
I can go ahead and get started.
Okay.
Tools of the trade. Whether or not the thought of high school geometry class stirs unpleasant memories, chances are that most of the actual material is long forgotten. Moreover, few of geometry's more pleasing properties are taught, leaving volumes of elegant transformations in the realm of esoteric knowledge. Lack of exposure to these age-old discoveries is the primary barrier to understanding synergetics. By now familiar with Fuller's underlying assumptions, we shall take time out to introduce some background material. The origins of humanity's fascination with geometry can be traced back 4,000 years to Babylonian and Egyptian civilizations. 2 millennia later, geometry flourished in ancient Greece, and its development continues today. Yet most of us know almost nothing about the accumulated findings of this search. Familiarity with some of these geometric shapes and transformation will ease the rest of the journey into the intricacies of synergetics. A little experimentation with basic geometric forms and procedures reveals the important role of space itself. The work of the other thinkers reinforces the fundamental premise of synergetics. Space has shape. All structures are formed according to spatial symmetries and constraints. It turns out that the number of symmetrical arrangements allowed by space is surprisingly limited. Perpetual synergetic interaction of relatively few patterns accounts for the seemingly endless variety of form. Even for readers whose background in geometry is already strong, reviewing it can be enjoyable and perhaps even illuminating. There are so many significant connections among polyhedral shapes and operations that even experienced geometers continually discover new ones. Bucky's delight in a newfound truth never lost in its intensity. Never lost in its intensity. Or no, its intensity. Sorry, not in. He promptly adopted each discovery into his growing synergetics inventory. If in his enthusiasm he appeared to be taking credit for age-old discoveries, let us, rather than judging, try to enter into the spirit of his search. And if egotism seemed to have gone hand in hand with enthusiasm, it is because both grew out of his constant willingness to see everything as for the first time. Both were part of the whole system, Bucky.
If we can pause right there, any comments or questions? I just want to point out, I've pointed out it before, see everything as if for the first time. This is a big principle in Buddhism. It's a big principle in any kind of meditation, is the concept of the beginner's mind.
Sure.
That if I look at something the way I've always looked at it, I'll always see the same thing I saw before. Where if I look at something as if it were for the first time, there's a chance I can see something, I can see reality like it really is, not like I thought it was, or not like it was yesterday to me. Make sense? So I think that's a really good point right there.
I think it's a good point. I mean, I think they're, I'm sorry, Steve, were you complete?
I was, thanks.
Yeah. No, I think that's an important way of kind of approaching things. And this gets back to some of Bucky's ideas with being childlike. And not necessarily, it's a way of removing bias. And so, kind of looking at things with a fresh pair of eyes. And, when you're talking about thinking about things in terms of systems and kind of you're looking for new connections and how new ideas work together. This is kind of coming back to what she had stated earlier in the above one of the earlier paragraphs, where you're constantly seeing new connections, right? You're not necessarily just coming back to the same thing. You're taking a beginner's approach. And that's where you can kind of continuously see new connections and make and have new ideas. And I think that's key when you're especially talking about things like innovation.
Cool. Richard,
well, I think, yeah. I mean, what that says to me right away is the parallel, if you want, to Bohemian dialogue. It's to always enter with the open dialogue sort of mindset, so that even though you've been somewhere 1,000 times, you're open to the possibility that the next dialogue might, in fact, reveal something you hadn't seen or known before. Yeah, so it's let me just react to this or comment on something that I find more and more intriguing as we go into these kinds of readings and some of the other dialogue sessions. But it has to do with the way in which we sometimes end a statement or end our the point that we want to get across, and we end the statement with right, which kind of puts everybody else on the spot right away of saying they have to go along with that, or they have to sound like they're openly disagreeing. And then the other one that it's interesting for me now is that when something happens where there's an agreement between two or more people in terms of what they're saying or discussing, and so somebody will say something and then the other person will respond by saying exactly, absolutely. And it's really, for me, interesting now in terms of how we want to be open, but at the same time, our language and our way of conversing tries to put things into a fixed sort of position. And so I'm either saying something and I finish what I'm saying, and then I throw out right. I conclude with right, which then forces you to have to sort of sound like you agree with me, or that you're in a position of, am I supposed to challenge him because I don't really believe everything he just said? And the reverse is when we hear something we really like, we respond by saying absolutely or exactly. I throw that out for our own dialogue around that. For me, it's a parallel to the idea of seeing everything as if it was for the first time. It's hard to do.
I think you're exactly right. No, I mean, no, to be quite honest, no, in some ways, no, I think that what you're saying, Richard, actually makes a lot of sense. In some ways, you know, so far as that, I'll just really quickly is, if you're in an echo chamber, right, then I said, right. If you're in an echo chamber, then and you're saying right, then everybody's just agreeing, and it's kind of you know, it doesn't necessarily lend itself to dialogue. But if it, you know, this is where I think something like psychological safety is really important. Somebody could say right and then challenge somebody, and as long as the integrity of the conversation is good, you know, is so far as like you know, that we're both searching for truth, or everybody's searching for truth, whomever it may be. There's that element of it that's I think it goes to the idea, if you're in a safe space, maybe you're willing to challenge that idea of right. But I also agree with you so far as, if you're finishing your sentences with right, maybe you're using one too many words, and using the proper number of words is you know, is important, you know, kind of in the sense that you leave something more open-ended, so you're actually inviting somebody to voice their opinion, as opposed to where it may feel like somebody is countering. So I think it's also contextual, right?
This whole discussion has got me back to this thing. Do you guys remember?
Very interesting, but not too nostalgic. Talking of nostalgia, there's someone hanging around my bunker who reminds me of an old friend. I knew it was you. Very interesting.
Many years.
Very interesting.
From now on, Richard, I'm not going to say right on, or I'm not going to say hoo-ah. I'm going to say very interesting.
Yeah. Well, you know, the other thing that what I like about the kind of dialogues we are into is becoming more attuned to the idea that when we're finished whatever we have to say, then we conclude with I'm complete. And and that's when it sort of really does open the door for somebody else to come in and say, hey, I really like what you said, or, you know, I think I kind of disagree, but it advances the dialogue, and you also realize that that somebody has actually opened the door, if you want, to come in and talk, rather than talking over them or trying to interfere with what they're trying to finish off saying.
Or to end the conversation. This is the way it is. Right.
Yeah.
I actually co-invented that concept of I'm complete, because I was used to do these workshops on personal sharing, and nobody wants to step on you when you're, and a couple of people on our calls tend to kind of like linger with their thought and they don't quite finish. And so it's nice to hear that I'm complete. That way we know it's now time to open up and get complete ourselves if we'd like to do that. Yeah, wonderful. I hold that as a really nice affirmation. So, okay, let's see.
And
We're on our
and,
way.
honestly, if you think about Amy's book, right, kind of wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So I'm going to read the next page here, if that's okay. Our most rewarding course is to immerse ourselves in the geometry. We shall first set the stage with some of the Greek basics and then move on to the work of Arthur L. Loeb of Harvard University, whose contribution to synergetics provides an analytical counterpart to the 800 pages of Fuller's more intuitive approach, before moving on to the thought-provoking twists of Fuller's mathematics. And you've had an experience of Arthur Loeb personally too, right? Is that right, Richard? Am I remembering properly?
Well, I haven't had a personal experience, although he may have been at that San Diego event, but he's the professor of Amy's who was really connected to Fuller's work and knew that he was coming onto campus at a particular time, and basically said to Amy, yeah, come with me. And that's when she first heard this guy. And she had the same kind of reaction that so many people have, is that it was a wonderful evening. I really liked what he had to say. But what did he say?
Exactly right. Yeah, cool.
Please interpret.
Yeah, as this thinking is encompassing and holistic, it would be counterproductive to scrutinize isolated parts of Fuller's geometry. Synergetics must be critically examined as a whole system before judging its contribution to mathematics. The emphasis and certainly the excitement in Fuller's ongoing research was the inherent omni-interaccommodation. That is, uncovered principles are never contradictory, but rather augment each other's significance. Fuller's developing inventory was thus continually strengthened, becoming more and more integral to his thinking. He was especially gratified in his later years to receive numerous letters from noted scientists reinforcing his discoveries with their observations from research in other fields. And I just want to interject here. If you look at, and I say this almost every week, if you look at Donald Hoffman, if you look at Stephen Wolfram, there are guys now doing research on, because quantum physics seems to have bottomed out at 10 to the minus 43rd, the Planck unit. What's beneath that? And it seems like what's revealing itself is some kind of geometry that, per what we've just read, this geometry, which defines that space itself has a shape, and that all structures are formed according to the spatial symmetries and constraints of this space, whatever it is. And of course, Hoffman and Stephen Wolfram are talking about four-dimensional. They bring up this thing called an amplitude-hedron, which is some kind of a polyhedron where all the points connect to all the points, which is exactly the example that the tetrahedron gives us, and is kind of exciting, I think. So I love that current sciences seems to be reaffirming what Bucky said, and people forgot what Bucky said. Go ahead.
Well, it was just, it's on the sentence that talks about as this thinking is encompassing and holistic, and then it goes on and be critically examined as a whole system. This has been another one of the things that kind of has intrigued me over time, is the two words holistic, one spelt with H, the other one spelt with W. And since we're talking about whole systems with a W, I've always been interested in how we keep those two terms, the two spellings, if you want, kind of used interchangeably. I've been trying to shift away from the use of holistic with an H, and and when I'm speaking about whole apart thinking or whole systems, I want to refer to all that as holistic with a W.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, whether even somebody like Amy Edmondson would have some understanding of whether it was just a conventional way of using those two words, or
Yeah.
whether there's some reason why we should maybe become a little bit more what's the word I want? Sort of precise, I guess, in terms of what was Bucky really referring to? The H holistic or the W holistic?
Well, I'm going to continue with your thought. And from now on, when I use the word holistic, I'm going to put a W in front of it. Do you know that there's a direct relationship between the word holy and the word whole and the word weird? If you look back at Germanic, the word weird goes back to Sanskrit, which is wird, or which evolved into become, werden in Germans, to become. The word came out of that same word. And this idea of being weird, the weird people back in the medieval times were the holistic, they were the healers. And to be a weird person was a noble title. That person's weird, meaning they're holy. And they're integrated. And then all of a sudden they started burning those people to stake. So suddenly weird was not such a desirable title. You didn't want to get that title. But from now on, I'm going to spell holistic with a W, Richard. And then I'm going to blame it on you.
Yeah. Well, here's another one. When I was in India and working with, well, I wasn't working, I was just basically a student of the communications people, and they were making all kinds of interesting films with virtually no budget. And anyway, they did one on self and person, and I always remember that they said, the same way you're talking about weird. Do you know the root meaning of savage, of referring to people as savages? And apparently, according to what they were talking about at the time, that the original meaning of savage was people of the forest. And so it somewhere along the line got turned into a negative and a very derogatory sort of interpretation of what that meant to be a savage.
Yeah, in fact, I just did a quick Google on the etymology of the word savage, and it comes a wood, of the woods, wild.
Yeah.
And it went from of the woods into wild. Interesting. So
yeah, and wild probably, went into crazy or off balance or
untamed, forest.
untamed.
Yeah, that's actually interesting that you're saying it like that.
And yet it's in a state of nature.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's something where we make words more, they lose their value.
Yeah.
Essentially by making them more narrow in how you're actually defining them.
And to my point, really, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I would just say that's something where as they become more narrow, they become used in a negative context when actually people think about how the word was originally used. It can be perverted. And so I've had this conversation recently, but of also a period of time is even the definition of something like virtue, where it can be misinterpreted as something as moral excellence and manliness in Latin, but in Greek, it is the good excellence. And so that this idea of it being more general is where it's a idea that it's much more nuanced and enables meaning excellence in all things, as opposed to making it very narrow, and then you're having a very specific perspective that is almost dogmatic, that's limiting its value. So you're actually dictating and saying, no, it's manliness. This is moral strength. This is what it is, as opposed to actually the idea of excellence overall. And I think that that's one of those where you can go too far with and I've been thinking about this, and even in terms of the concept of statistics and overfitting. But in any case, I won't go into the whole litany, but yeah, you're basically taking a concept and reducing it to a point where it's the meaning has the ability for it to be meaningful is lost.
Right. I want to acknowledge also that you put the Greek origin of the word holos in here, meaning whole or all or entire or total. And it's starts with an H, but they refer to whole with a W. I want to do that. Richard, you got something there?
No, I'm fine.
Okay,
This
good.
is good.
I wanted to reaffirm, because I don't think it's obvious, that that the inherent omni-inter-accommodation of this geometry, to mention Stephen Wolfram's hypergraphs, it's inherently omni-inter-accommodating. That means every node connects to every node. That's what I'm seeing when I see this word, and it's not obvious. So I thought I would repeat that just to reinforce. So because the tetrahedron being a four-dimensional, to me, the tetrahedron is four-dimensional. All nodes relate to all nodes. Stephen Wolfram takes it much further. And I'm ready to continue reading if everybody's ready. Everybody ready?
Yeah.
Bucky's guiding purpose in developing synergetics was to reacquaint us with universe. Such eagerness is compelling. Beautiful, beautiful bubbles. Eternally regenerative universe. Ecstasy is in discovering nature's beautiful agreement. We do him and ourselves a disservice to expect his approach to fit comfortably into the traditional scholarly framework. Unacknowledged by academic institutions for most of his life, he felt unencumbered by their conventions. But we are not, and this volume will attempt to locate sources wherever possible. This is kind of the point I made when I kind of opened tonight, as how she's doing everything she can to interrelate this thing and interaccommodate. Onward, let's take another look at geometry. The journey itself is fascinating, as well as full of useful tools for understanding Fuller's work. Then there's a footnote regarding Arthur Loeb's work. Cool. Richard, do you feel like reading? If not, we'll pass it on to, go ahead. Go ahead, Richard.
We talked about that Plato's discovery.
Yeah,
Plato presents. Yeah.
Presents.
Yeah, well, my book says discovery.
Oh, really?
Oh, that's interesting.
My book says presents.
Let me see what mine says, actually.
Mine says presents as well.
Yeah, I've got
what date is your book?
I've got the soft cover 1992 paperback.
I've got a soft cover of 87. Mine is soft cover 87.
Yeah, that's the original one.
Huh. Interesting. And yours says Plato what, Richard?
Well, then it looks like it's the same. The Platonic polyhedra, as their name suggests, have been around for almost 2 millennia. However, despite the fact that the 5 shapes, also called regular polyhedra, are well known, few people are aware of what exactly defines this group, and fewer still of the implications about space itself. The requirements seem lenient at first. They are 2, the faces of a polyhedron must be identical, and the same number of them must meet at each vertex. The tetrahedron fits with its 4 triangles and 4 equivalent 3-valent vertices. Notice the roots of the word equivalent. From these 2 criteria alone, one might suspect that the existence of many more regular polyhedra.
Let me ask you, Richard, what does your book say? It says Plato what as a top?
Discovery.
Thank you.
Plato's, yeah. Possessive, yeah.
All right. I'm just going to make a note of that, and that's in 92 version.
Right.
All righty, cool. So she tries to spice it up by making a discovery. Cool. Cool. All righty. Joe Split, continue, please, reading.
Yeah, triangles. Let's study the possibilities step by step, beginning with the simplest polygon, fewest sides, and the smallest number of edges meeting at each vertex. In keeping with Fuller's use of vectors as edges, this study will be confined to straight edges, in quotations. It is quickly apparent that a minimum of 3 edges must meet at each vertex of a polyhedra, for if vertexes join only 2 straight edges, the resulting array is necessary planar. This lower limit can also be expressed in terms of faces, for we can readily visualize that a corner needs at least 3 polygons in order to hold water, which is another way of saying that the inside is separated from the outside as specified by Fuller's definition of system. The minimal polygon is a triangle. The 3 triangles around one vertex form a pyramid, the base of which automatically creates a 4th triangle face. As all corners and all faces are identical, the first regular polyhedron, a tetrahedron, is completed after 1 step.
Well, I sure don't understand that. And she shows figure 1A.
Yeah.
There's 1A.
Yeah, so what she's saying is that if you form 3 upright triangles, you automatically form the 4th in the bottom.
Oh, I see. And so it's not a 4-sided pyramid, it's a 3-sided pyramid.
Well, no, but the bottom is the 4th side, the 4th
Right,
face.
the bottom is the 4th side, yeah. The base of which automatically creates a 4th face, right on. But why does she call it a pyramid? That kind of confuses.
Well, that to me, that's the interesting thing about, well, it's a triangle pyramid.
Right.
It's not an Egyptian pyramid.
Right,
And of
exactly.
course, the Egyptian pyramid, when we understand it now in geometry, it's half an octahedron.
Right. And I think actually the Egyptians intended to show half an octahedron, that the other half is down below that structure.
Yeah.
Let me see, what was I going to do here? I'm just going to check out pyramid definition.
And then 4B is the square-based pyramid. And 4C, there we are, the octahedron.
See, this defining it a square or triangular base and sloping sides that meet at the point at the top. So they're acknowledging here a pyramid is either a square or a triangle, which is nice.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just type in pyramid and we let the AI generate something, it says a pyramid is a 3-dimensional shape with a polygonal base and triangular sides.
Yeah, and then it's silent then on whether the base is square or triangular.
Right. Yeah, very interesting. And she's referring to figures 4, 1A. There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
I think
The other thing as we go on, the thing that's been intriguing me around the Platonic polyhedra is the common reference to them being Platonic solids.
exactly right.
Yeah.
We've talked about this before, and the idea is they're not solid, they're actually energy frameworks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe she'll explore that a little bit as she goes. You want to continue reading?
Yeah, next, the second regular polyhedron can be started by surrounding one vertex with 4 triangles, resulting in the traditional square-based pyramid, 4-1B. But as our specifications for regularity indicate that all vertices must connect 4 edges, an additional edge is required at each of the 4 vertices around the pyramid's base, bringing the total to 12 edges. By connecting the 4 dangling edges, 4, 1C, we introduce a 6th vertex, which is also surrounded by 4 triangles. The result is an octahedron with 8 triangular faces and 6 4-valent vertices. Both criteria for regular polyhedra are satisfied, and so the octahedron is added to our list. As the procedure is thus far simple and successful, analogy suggests the next step. 5 triangles around 1 vertex form a shallow pyramid, figure 4.2a. Oh, that's interesting. Paying attention as before to nothing but the 2 rules, we continue to employ triangular faces while making sure that 5 of them surround each corner. The structure essentially builds itself in that there is only one possible outcome, and we don't even have to know what it is to be able to finish the task. The icosahedron with 20, in Greek icosa, triangles and 12 valent corners is indeed regular, figure 4.2b. 4.2b. Oh,
while you've been reading, Richard, I've had the picture up front here, and you're describing exactly what happens here. Here's your 5 triangles in a pentagonal base,
right.
and then they connect to other triangles. And if we draw them together at the bottom, just like we did at the octahedron, so the dangling things are brought, there's another point down there, we end up with an icosahedron. So as you were reading, I was looking at the pictures, it made a lot more sense.
Yeah, and they have that helps you understand the top and the bottom of the icosahedron, and then the wraparound is the whatever that number of triangles is, must be 10, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's 10 plus 5 plus 5 equals 20.
Yeah. Cool.
Can you kind of really quickly pull that those 3 diagrams up again? I just need to see something.
See what?
Sorry, I don't have my bucket. Yeah. Let me just see something. All right. Thank you. No, I'm figuring. I'm just looking at something else.
What would be really helpful, I think, would be to see these 2 kind of diagrams kind of side by side. So and then because the way she completes this, by adding the 4th, these dangle down, then you bring them together with C. There's the octahedron. She's doing the same thing here. She doesn't draw the 5 things down, but she connects them with triangles.
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. Cool.
Yeah, I'm just looking at a model. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No,
what's that, Joe?
You were talking.
I didn't hear you.
No, I interrupted you.
I'm good.
No, I was just looking at a model that was shared to the trim tab group earlier today, and how some of that actually could, fits into what we're talking about here.
Conversation about trim tabs?
Well, it was, but it was an addiction book that was actually shared by Kurt McNamara, and how he uses it, and he does some modeling, and it's interesting. I'm just looking at the modeling that he does, and it's not totally dissimilar, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it, Richard, to when talking about addiction, to some of, yeah, that is cool to see it like that. Actually, could you snip that whole thing?
Yeah, I think, let me see, can I snip the whole thing?
Yeah, and then put
I'm
it.
not sure that I can. Let me see if I
should
can.
be able to.
Well, because I can put it together eventually. Let me just see.
No, I was just,
Oh yeah, I can snip it.
yeah.
And then I'll put it on a that's now, oh, did
Yeah.
it say?
Should have. But Richard would know this all.
What would Richard know?
The addiction book that was sent out, did you have a chance to look at it, Richard, by any chance? Or
No, I haven't looked at it yet.
no, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. Where it
But
goes through.
is this by what's her name, Clark?
It is, yes, I believe it is. So
Yeah, she's fascinating in the sense of somebody who has picked up on this kind of work, and I think in some ways fairly quietly has utilized it in the addictions and penal systems in a way that
right.
many people are not aware of how well she's been able to adapt it into that kind of work.
No, yeah, and it's actually the way. Actually, Steve, you'd really like this too. But it is Bucky's concept. But it's interesting seeing these shapes, in the way Amy's actually put them here. I mean, you can always see the parallels, but it's just I can see one that's how it's put into practice, but she's actually given the foundational knowledge that's actually necessary to understand this, and that's pretty much the value of the book, by making this accessible, which is really hard to do.
Okay, was there more for you to read there, Richard?
Yeah, well, might as well finish it up here. And then once more, then bring 6 triangles together at a corner. But wait, 6 60-degree angles add up to 360, or the whole plane, figure 42C. So the hexagon base. And then she goes on, an unprecedented result. This indicates that we could surround vertices with 6 equilateral triangles indefinitely and never force the collection to curve around to close itself off. A space-enclosing system is therefore unattainable with exclusively 6 valent vertices. Is it possible we have exhausted the possibilities for a regular polyhedra out of triangles? We simply cannot have fewer than 3 or more than 5 triangles around all vertices and create a closed finite system. We thus encounter a first upper limit.
What page are you on when you say first upper limit? We're not quite to squares, are we? Oh yeah, we did finish squares.
Well, we're just going into squares.
Okay.
No, yeah.
Oh, that's right. You read this paragraph.
Yeah, this
right?
last paragraph here.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. I put together a little graphic that shows those parts together, and I can kind of clean it up still a little bit more.
Appreciate that. That's kind of you.
But let's continue reading.
But just on that, am I getting it right? What she's saying is that you can't go beyond 5 and be able to get a space enclosing system.
I see. You cannot go beyond 5.
You cannot go beyond 5.
That's what I hear her say.
I don't know if, I mean, that's not what I've heard in the past.
Well, I mean, even in these diagrams, she's showing all of them capable of forming a space enclosing system. And then when she shows the hexagon, all you can get is a continuous planar kind of system, which
Right.
is kind of interesting because this is what happened to the three that discovered the Bucky fullerene, the carbon-60.
Mm,
And originally they had a memory picture of the Expo 67 dome, and their memory picture said it was made up of hexagons. And
Right.
so when they tried to put hexagons together to get it to curl up into a sphere, it couldn't happen because a hexagon is like chicken wire.
Right.
And it just keeps rolling out flat, 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 flat. And
Right.
until they realized that no, it wasn't just hexagons, it included pentagons.
Right.
And that's also where there is a story, and it sounds like it's now an urban myth, but it was the story of one of the scientists. They were meeting in his home, and he had to take a break and go say goodnight to his 8 or 9-year-old son. And so he went into the son's bedroom, which was full of sports memorabilia. And all of a sudden he saw the kid's soccer ball. And he said, "Oh
yeah.
my God, a soccer ball is hexagons and pentagons." And so then they came back and he started putting together hexagons and pentagons, and all of a sudden the thing started to curl.
Yeah.
And so this just reminded me of, if this is true, then yeah, anything hexagonal is going to end up being planar.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's how you can always see that what Amy was saying earlier is that the idea you always see new connections. You never know where you're going to see them.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Cool.
Interesting. Would you like?
Shall I read squares?
I can read it. I mean,
Okay, well, it's my turn.
is it? Yeah, go ahead.
No, maybe it is. It's your turn, Joe. I did first. You did first. Go ahead. Thank you.
Squares. Let's block up and let's back up. Block up. I was thinking about. Let's back up and start the procedure over with another kind of polygon. Continuing the step-by-step approach, we change from triangles to squares by increasing the number of sides by 1. The method is reliable if plotting. What happens if two squares come together? Again, that's just a hinge. So start with 3. If there are 3 squares, hang on. If there are 3 squares around what? Yeah, sorry about that. Around one corner, the same must be true for all corners. And as before, the structure is self-determining. Continue to join 3 squares at available vertices until the system closes itself off with 6 squares at 8 corners. This is the most familiar shape in our developing family of regular polyhedra, the ubiquitous cube. Next, we gather 4 squares at a vertex and immediately hit ground. 4 times 90 is 360. The whole plane again. And while such groups of 4 will generate graph paper indefinitely, they can never close off as a system. So it's 4 squares. It's interesting because I'm thinking this through as I'm reading this.
Yeah. I don't know how she got from squares to graph paper.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to.
Start with 3. If there are 3 squares around one corner, the same must be true for all corners as before. The structure is self-determining. Continue to join those 3 squares available vertices until the system closes itself off. The 6 squares and 8 corners, we have our most familiar shape, the cube. But somehow she goes from cubes to graph paper. We gather 4 squares at a vertex. Oh, and immediately hit the ground. So in other words, if we wrap the squares, we got the cube. If we don't wrap the squares, we're stuck with on
On a plane, yeah.
a plane.
Okay. All right, that makes sense.
Yeah. So she can be as confusing as Bucky. There's your cube. Okay, you want to continue with pentagons, Joe?
Yeah, sure. Triangle squares. Now we come to pentagons. 3 of them around each corner works. A system exists as soon as there are 12 pentagons and 23 valiant corners, called the pentagonal dodecahedron. Dodeca is Greek for 12. It adheres to the definition of regular polyhedra. Okay.
Are all dodecahedrons made out of pentagons? So why should she call it pentagonal?
Or is it I'm sorry,
Well,
pentagonal.
pentagonal or pentagonal depends on whether you're from Canada and want to be polite to Canadians or not. No, I don't know. I just on NPR this last week, they had a big thing about how New York Times is using Wordle and how the whole world has a heart attack when they use American English spelling instead of
Right.
I know some people that actually say that about the entire internet.
Yeah.
And how it can be actually it can be actually so how it's actually terrible, like in the sense that the Americanized version of English is kind of dominating, and how that has an influence over people's thinking.
Wow.
So anyway.
So evidently there are a couple of different kinds of dodecahedrons. And so a pentagonal or a pentagonal dodecahedron is different than this guy. In geometry, a dodecahedron or dodecahedron or a duodecahedron in any polyhedron with 12 flat surfaces. The most familiar is the regular dodecahedron with regular pentagons, which is a Platonic solid. There are 3 regular star dodecahedra, all constructed as stellations of the convex from Wikipedia. I'm not sure what that's saying either.
That's something I have to go back through.
Yeah. I thought I was going to understand this a lot better, but at least I'm learning what I don't understand anyway. Richard, what are you seem to be deeply in thought.
Yeah, I'm just trying to read that through as well. I mean, the pentagonal is referring to the fact that they're all pentagons.
Exactly.
And it's also, then she says the dodecahedron, that word is there because of it's Greek for 12.
Right.
So it adheres to the definition of a regular polyhedron for 4.
Right.
What
bothers me right off the bat is she spells out 23 by mixing Arabic numerals and alphabet, which that drives me crazy. Why doesn't she give that a number 23-valent? But she spells it that way. That's interesting.
I think she spells it that way purposely to talk about the corners, essentially.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts, Richard? Am I distracting you?
Well, you see, the other thing about the 4 around a corner, this goes back to that little formula that the pentagonal dodecahedron in this picture doesn't show all the vertices connected with each other, but what it does show is that, well, or does it? See, the point I'm getting at is that if you've got 4 around a corner, that means that 4 around a corner. Yeah, it really means if you stretch it out and connect to all the other endpoints, you'll end up connecting to a pentagonal kind of shape, because each one of the vertices is going to have 4 coming out of it. So if you take a pentagon and you do the formula r equals n squared minus n minus 1 over 2, you end up getting, or no, you end up multiplying the vertices by a number less than the vertices. In other words, n minus 1. So if you're starting with 5, n minus 1 is 4, 5 times 4 is 20, and that will be the answer of, and divided by 2 is 10. That's how many interconnections there are in a polyhedral, or I mean a pentagonal shape, whole system. That makes sense?
Kind of.
So that every time you have a vertex, and you've got everything connected to each other, if you've got 4 things going out of that vertex, then you're going to end up with a pentagonal kind of geometric figure. And if you're going the other way, if you're looking at a pentagon and you want to know how many interconnections are there between those 5, then that's when you get 5 times 4 minus 1, or I mean 5 times 5 minus 1 is 4, 5 times 4 is 20, 20 divided by 2 is 10, and there will be 10 interconnections between those 5.
Well, I
Yeah.
wish I could see that graphically.
Yeah. It's interesting how this is starting to see, kind of some of these connections, and I'm trying to think of it in terms of how this would relate back to what we were talking about earlier with words and not defining them too far. And what that means for the corners and the edges and the connections.
Well, it also has
Yeah.
something to do with complexities, because it and the interactions, the tensile connections in between. So if you go with 4, and we can visually see a tetrahedron, we know that there are 6 interconnections between those 4. But if we go up 1 more from 4 to 5, the interconnections increase from 6 to 10. And if we go up to 6, just add 2 more, then the interconnections go from 6 to 15. And so the interconnections are increasing sort of exponentially. And what's happened to me over time is that explains an awful lot of why the number of things, or the number of people who are sort of interconnecting with each other, the complexity of those interrelationships increases exponentially to the increasing numbers of the people involved in this case, or the nodes that are involved. So it really comes back to how important it is to understand relationships in order to have some understanding of the complexity of whatever number of things are part of a system.
Right. And even understanding the relationships. I'm thinking about this in terms of words, and I didn't mean to use the word right there for a moment there, but I agreed with you, Richard. Is that but it's understanding how increasingly narrow a definition then becomes. And I'm thinking about this in terms of like because part of this is seeing connections and seeing patterns, right? And not part of it, this is what it is. So we have the systems, we have the idea of what a system is, but we have to make sure that the concepts align with the structures. So there's like kind of two ways, I mean, more than two ways. And then from there, there's three things that I'm thinking about. It's understanding the connection between objects with patterns in a system, then thinking about the concepts, you know, the concepts themselves, right? And then the type of reasoning that is applied is the third part, as another part of like thinking about this, like how we reason about this from a generalized principle perspective, right? Where we start to apply generalized principles to a problem. Or, you know, do we have an inductive approach? And how that impacts perception. So that, you know, I'm thinking about how those three things come together. And what I'm thinking more or less is that if we don't have integrity in our words, as Amy had covered earlier in the book, how perverted those connections can become. Even if you were to use the system, if you use if you apply concepts within the system incorrectly, then the connections that you're making are going to be distorted.
Yeah, well, see, one of the things that's happened to me in my discipline is that it's tried to claim it has some uniqueness because it focuses on relationships. In other words,
Right.
the concept that has been built into that profession is person interacting environment, called pi. And so the argument is that we're different than psychologists or other kinds of helpers because we pay attention to the interaction between the person and an environment. We don't pay attention to just the person or the environment, in other words, the nodes. But when you actually see people in my kind of discipline work with that concept, then you realize that this focus on relationships is pure rhetoric. They have no way of actually demonstrating that that's what they're doing, and that's what I find even in some of our other group discussions, is that people recognize the importance of relationships, but then they just pass through them and they don't realize the impact. So in this discussion, when you realize if you got four of us together, there's 6 interconnection possibilities. Add one more and it jumps to 10. Add another one, it jumps to 15. Add another one. And all of a sudden, if you really are focused on relationships, the importance of the integrity of the tensile in between this, you're starting to basically say, oh my God, this is getting more complex. And you really have an appreciation for the complexity of however number of things you've got interacting with each other. And you realize how many more of these interconnections you have to start paying attention to. And when you experience that or feel that, then you really are behaving in a way that you appreciate the importance of the increasing complexity of adding nodes and people and whatnot. Otherwise, you just use the word relationship in a rhetoric way, not in an applied way.
I agree with you, Richard. I mean, it's like even the idea of the number, 15, right? What does it mean? Right. So it becomes rhetoric and rhetoric in the negative sense, because rhetoric actually is there. It can be a good, is actually something to be studied. But what does 15 mean? Right. And then if you're just applying concepts that are incorrect, then all of a sudden that becomes a distortion. You know 15 exists, but you don't know what the 15 actually is. And this is where I think that this idea of the understanding the essential elements of something it's not just about getting to 15, because then you start making things up. It's understanding how the whole works together, and then getting to the essence so that you can understand what is this little energy that needs to be put into something. So I would honestly, if you think about it in terms of this is simplification as well.
But
Because
the 15,
if you understand the actual what 15 is, right? What those 15 elements are, the complexities, the essence of those complexities,
well,
then you
but-
understand every node, so to speak, every connection and its essence, as opposed to because otherwise you can create a system that is completely turned in on itself.
Well, but you do know what the 15 are.
Well, it's 15, right? You know the number.
Well,
But if you go looking, if I go looking for 15, so if I'm building a car and I know how many connections that I need at the most essence, if I go get 15 sticks, it's not necessarily going to give me what a car is. You have to understand what
you
the
see,
car,
that's the
right?
thing. We're not talking about 15
Yeah.
sticks. We're talking about 15 interconnections.
Correct.
And those interconnections.
Well, I was using that as a distortion. That's
no, but this is what I'm trying to get at is this whole thing of if there's 15 connections, then there's going to be 5 nodes. So,
right.
And then because of that formula that we've been working with, because I divided by 2, that means that it's one interaction going back and forth, or basically going one way. But then if I take the 2 off, because if we're in dialogue, then you have something to say, then I have something to say. So that doubles the interaction. And so now the 15 turn into 30. And so right away, it helps us understand, maybe why, I want to work with a minimum of 4 in, say, a small group, because I'm only have to pay attention to 6, maybe 12 interactions if the dialogue is going on. But if I get up to 5 and I get to 15 and 30 and then 6, then I realize that's an awful lot of interaction to be paying attention to as let's say, a group facilitator or something along that line. And so right away, the complexity is recognized by the number of interconnections that exist between the n number of people or nodes.
Sure.
I think that complexity is like acknowledged, but nobody knows what to do with it.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
And they go, oh, this is getting too complicated. And so what some organizations do is they break into small groups.
Right.
And they have the groups interrelating with each other, but they're not approaching it from a geometric point of view.
No.
They're only approaching because it seems to be a practical way to overcome the overwhelming complexity of 6 people work together.
And it's like what you just did too, that the complexity word then gets turned into complicated, and then it gets turned down to, well, let's simplify it so we'll only work with 3 or 4 or whatever it happens to be.
Well, and here's the thing is that it's what if in that process you lose the ability to actually understand value and how to make trade-offs.
Yeah,
and that's the key. Is that
was going to be my point? Is if I got 12 people here, I just broke into 3 small groups of 4, but there are some dangling relationships that are not being handled, and that's where the complexity comes in. That most people have no concept about, even acknowledge it. The mathematical formula is a wonderful beginning,
right?
So that it solves any problem.
It doesn't, not at all. No,
because of what Joe is saying.
Yeah, exactly. If you don't understand, if you understand 15 and you don't know why you're there, then that's a problem. Yeah. Like, I mean, so and that's the idea of articulating what value is
Right.
why you're there, and then breaking down to what an impact is.
I have 8 people in the group, but I only have 3 wall sockets, and each of those wall sockets only have 2 plugins. So that's handled 6 people. There's 2 left over. They're not going to plug in. They're not going to plug in. This is interesting.
No, it's an important thing, because it's something where you're and I was looking at some different functions as far as predicting the impact of technology, and people apply the formula, and this is what was being talked about in the conference. Actually, I should put the video in the chat. They'll apply a formula, and it doesn't necessarily, it reduces things to a point where it doesn't align with reality, because they actually don't necessarily even think about the fundamental ideas behind the formula itself. So it was interesting to see, and that's actually how I ended up kind of looking a little bit more deeply at overfitting.
Did you put a link in the chat? Did you say?
I will. I mean, I have to. I mean, the professor actually calls it out and says, like, that the function doesn't necessarily work, that the formula doesn't necessarily work. So he has to do kind of an analysis that's showing that you can apply this formula, but it's not going to have the predictive power that people think it would have, that it's not sufficient. So it's basically, you have a formula, you apply it to a problem broadly, and it won't necessarily align with reality.
Yeah. Good. So he basically,
well, this one's interesting though, because the formula we've been talking about, I think does align itself with the reality.
Oh, it does. No, don't get me wrong. It's not that I'm implying that it doesn't. I'm implying that the way, if you just apply a formula, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to come out with some kind of answer that's aligned with reality, if you don't understand why you're applying the formula in the first place, or what the actual the concepts that the formula is actually even using, the inputs and the outputs. If you don't have an idea, and this is what I was going with words earlier, if the inputs are garbage, it doesn't matter if you have 15 or not.
Well, this is the point I think what we're getting at. You're now talking what I would call is a procedural, if you want, formula, a formula that's trying to predict an outcome.
Well, that's one particular instance, yeah. But even if it's descriptive,
just hang on. The other one that we're looking at is the formula that gives you the pattern,
right?
And so, and that's the other thing that I've been finding over time is that it's one thing to think of something systemically in like a network or a pattern, and another thing to think of it procedurally as in a methodology or a process that has X number of steps or phases to get from what might be considered the input to the output, if you want, or a problem to a solution. And so one is systemic, and the other one is systematic and procedural. And how do you put those two together so that they kind of work in harmony? It's back into the coexistence yin-yang stuff that we often talk about. In this case, for me, it's putting the systemic together with the systematic to be better at getting, say, from a problem to a solution.
Well,
and
that's micro and macro. I mean, essentially,
no, it's not.
In a way.
It's not micro,
well,
macro.
if you're going, if you're going to the procedure, right? And you're looking at things from a system, you have the system aspect, right? Then that's the macro, and then you go down to the procedural. And so that the idea, so you're not seeing it that way.
No, because what I'm seeing is like micro and macro can be, they're both systemic.
Right.
in a pattern. But when you then add the systematic part, the
That's
methodology
automatic,
part,
yeah.
then you have more of a linear type of methodology that's being exercised to get from input to output.
Well, right. And so that's why I wasn't looking at it. I was looking at it from a systems point of view to the procedure. So from the universal to the particular, that not the systematic perspective. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you on that. So from that perspective, I think it's right, but I do think how does it become procedural? Is it becomes procedural because the concepts, the ideas themselves are no longer, they've been reduced to a point where they're no longer systematic. So the example that I was using a little bit earlier, when you make something really specific, and reduce a word to a very, very kind of meaningless, to a meaningless point, and you then make that the node, it's no longer becomes a connection, it becomes just a procedural. And so that's where, that if you pick the wrong inputs, that you're basically just doing things from a procedural and operational perspective, as opposed to a systemic perspective.
Well, that's where it comes back into how do you combine the systemic with the procedural, or the systemic with the systematic? Whereas probably a lot of us, we end up understanding one or the other, but we haven't figured out how to put them together in a way that they work with each other.
Right. No, I think so. I think that's actually a big problem. When you have when you define things again too narrowly, if you take even the same concept of an idea that, organizationally speaking, when people narrowly look at things from a very specific domain and they think they're applying a systematic approach, but they're actually looking at it from a domain, then that's problematic because you can apply these concepts, but I've seen models where people are then divided in the model, and it's like, no, you can't divide people into that's the whole, you're messing up to the point. It's actually people, then how the people interact, and that's where it's not an accountant versus a engineer, or or a manager versus an employee. It's like, no, there's the people and how they interact with the organization. But that's an example of reducing something is to a point where it's no longer meaningful.
I think the other thing that you're describing is when someone takes something like an interaction and turns it into a node, then you have the kind of problem that you're talking about, because the interaction is not a node. Right. And yet that's what we tend to do. We want to turn everything into a node, into a corner, into a vertex. Yeah.
Okay, and that's significant because if I turn it into a node, then suddenly how I've given it a static definition.
Yeah.
Where if I
That's
leave
exactly
it be a relationship, it can be in flux.
That's right.
And if it's a node, it's no longer in flux. And so I think I can handle it. And I just warped reality.
And it doesn't become an either or proposition. Is that's the thing. It becomes a both and from that perspective. You're no longer labeling something that artificial. And that's my point about the accountant or something like that. Like, to treat an accountant different than the value of the mission or something like that, or an employee by kind of like segmenting them into labeling them is it creates hierarchy, to be quite honest, but it also creates kind of, well, this is what I do and this is what as opposed to thinking about how all things kind of work together in order to accomplish a mission.
Yeah, exactly.
I brought up this chart because you were mentioning the formulas, and we were mentioning some numbers, and to me, maybe the numbers were a little bit elusive. There are two formulas here, and I'm not sure I understand them. Sum of adjacent relationships is n-1 squared, and this is the number of relationships or interrelationship, n squared minus n over 2. So this describes that if there are 4 nodes, n is 4 squared is 16 minus n, which is 4. That makes it 12 divided by 2 is 6. And that's
Right.
this here. Now,
Right.
but now
And
what
then,
is, go ahead.
well, then you see, this is where I was having trouble for a long, long time, and Kirby Younger helped me with it, but the formulas are the same. Because the other one is you take the number of n's, the nodes,
Wait a
and
minute. Which two formulas are the same, Richard?
the n squared minus n over 2 is the same as n times n minus 1 over 2.
N squared minus n over 2 is the same as
N times n minus 1 over 2.
n times
So
n minus 1.
So you did the 4 squared minus n is 12 over 2 is 6. Then the next one is you do 4 times 3 equals 12 over 2 equals 6.
Right on. So I just represented those formulas right here. This should be n. Whoops. Yeah, good. And then I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. So n squared minus n over 2 is the same as n times n minus 1 over 2.
Yeah, so if you take a look at the formula n times n minus 1, and you just work with the formula, then you have to go, n times n, well, that's n squared, and
Right.
then n times 1 is 1, so that's n. So now you've got 4 squared minus n. What Kirby showed me is that you don't have to do that. You just take it as it stands, and you've got the 4, and then you take the n minus 1, will give you 3, and then you just simply say 4 times 3 gets you your 12 right away, and then you divide by 2. So you don't have to go through the n squared minus n, which for me and other people, when I tried to explain it before, just the idea of having to work with squaring a number and then subtracting another number scares them off.
Yeah.
But when you can say it's just a simple, take the number, minus, subtract 1 off that number, and then multiply the two numbers. Oh, that's easy. 4 times 3 equals 12.
Yeah, that's what Amy was saying in the beginning of the chapter here. Essentially people are scared off by geometry.
Yeah.
And that some of it's not necessarily even retained, but when you look at it in terms of patterns, and this is actually and this is where I do wish Anne was here, is that being taught through experience as opposed to being taught in what the system that we currently have for the most part. I mean, not all schooling systems are the same, but our approaches are the same, I should say. And so, but when you have more of this experiential learning versus this more systematic learning, it becomes much more real, and you start to look at patterns and connections between things, as opposed to looking at just applying something and not necessarily knowing what it really kind of is meant to do.
But
and
I'll give you an example of what I tried to do anyway. It was say, when you have two people in let's say a counseling relationship, so you've got two people, and I sat them in a chair, and then they could see, well, what's going on between us is a relationship. So that's one. Then I took what the individual is connected to in a minimum whole, and we put 3 chairs around the person that's getting the counseling, and then we put 3 chairs around the person who is doing the counseling, because that represents their sort of basic systemic world, and now you've got 8 chairs, and people can count between the chairs, and they can say, oh yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, that's how many relationships that I'm having to pay attention to. Then I can see the relationship between myself and the person I'm trying to help, that's 1. So now we got 5. And then the relationships that affect me, that I bring into it from my own life experience, there's another 4 or another 6. So all of a sudden, the idea of one relationship between 2 people who are trying to, one being a helper and the other being the helpee, so to speak, all of a sudden that one relationship goes to 6, 12, 13. And that you're having to pay attention to what's going on in that person's life, what's going on between you and that person, and what's going on in your life that may impact whether or not you behave, positively or negatively, or with bias or no bias. And so now I'm sitting there having to deal with the possibility of 13 different relationships that are going on while I'm sitting in the so-called counseling relationship with one other person.
I'm looking ahead, and we're going to get into Euler's equation next.
yeah,
And so that will be, I think it'll have a bearing on this whole conversation.
Yeah.
it does.
Help
It has
me,
a really big impact.
Help me, where did we leave off here? You didn't read about
No, I didn't read that.
figure 4. We left off at where?
Keep going up.
Did we read this? Try 4 around the corner? I think we read this.
No.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
we got down to a limited family, and we didn't do that one.
That's
I
right.
mean, keep going.
We got down to a limited family. Keep going up.
Keep going.
I'm
No,
sure
keep going down.
Oh, that's what I thought.
Hang on.
Family on what page? What page, Richard?
Well,
We weren't
again,
up.
I'm using my pages, so it's
What
Keep going
pages
up.
are you using? What
Keep
page
going
are
up.
you?
my page would say 41, but
I see your page is way different. Okay, we got,
keep
in
going.
other
there it
words, we
is.
got
So
down to,
there it is,
Yeah.
right there.
I didn't know. No, having exhausted
right, good.
probabilities
So-
of hexagons.
I think it would behoove anybody to listen to our discussion, and they'd be totally confused, and then we'll resolve it next week. Okay,
Steve, keep going up.
how far up?
Keep going up. Yeah, I mean, I didn't remember, or well,
We
keep going
did
down.
do all
Okay.
this. That's the
Yeah,
book.
we
There's
did
your
do it. Yeah, okay.
pentagonal dodecahedron.
Yeah, you're right there.
And there's your
And then-
appendix A, which I actually showed appendix A and showed the
Right, and then
calculations.
and then stop there. That's, I thought, having exhausted all pentagonal possibilities. I don't remember that being read.
Okay, should we read from there then?
And if you want
Or
to
should we read from next time?
I mean, we might as well read it next time, because then that way,
It
we
might
can
not
actually talk
even
about it.
hurt. It might not even hurt to read the whole thing again without discussing it as we move into Euler's law.
Yeah,
So-
no, I'm actually gonna take a little bit of time this week and take a look at that. I did, it's Thanksgiving, so I'll actually have some time to do that.
Yeah.
So, and
Because
then,
Euler's law, we start getting into a table and start doing calculations. And I'm really interested in how these interface with the cosmography calculations that I showed, somewhat what Richard was talking about. And by the way, which I'm having trouble coagulating, because as I look at this guy right here, there are two formulas here, n squared minus n over 2, but there's also n minus 1 squared. And the calculations are different, and there are evidently spherical relationships relative to linear relationships. And I think that this diagram here goes to show that when there are more than 6 interrelationships, it starts getting complicated.
yeah,
And
no, yeah.
you know, in terms of how I'm going to look and structure and how this feedback, knowing that this is actually a hypergraph and every point is connected to every point.
Yeah.
It's just that how does it look to me from my perspective? So this is kind of interesting here. Anyway,
Yeah.
so then we'll probably we'll at least start from I don't know what we'll do.
Right before a limited family, right before that.
We should start with the limited family.
No, before that, right before that, paragraph before that.
Well, then right before that is that one paragraph above. Okay, then I'll put a little line there. I'm tempted to read the whole thing without discussion, just to get us bearing. So when we go into Euler's formula, it's going to make some sense. Anyway, I'm thrilled. It's approaching our 0 hour. Joe, how are you feeling, and what are your takeaways tonight?
Really great discussion. I really appreciated everything that going through this is I think the way it actually started with the idea that you're always going to see new connections between things when you kind of think in this way, by having our conversations, that really was helpful, in that sense. So I gotta be honest, I was really interested in Richard's pie use of the idea where it's the person, the interaction, the environment. I think that's actually something that's often overlooked, is environmental concern, experiences. And so that from that perspective, that was just something random that, I know you were just using it as an example, but nonetheless that was helpful. But I also understand, that this, kind of looking at the, having a formulaic way of thinking and then being able to really understand what the essential elements and inputs need to be in a formula, and thinking about that in those terms, I think is really important, because then is having a model that is more of a systems approach where you can kind of look at the connections between things, as opposed to a very procedural approach. Both are needed, not to say that one isn't needed. One's needed, but one's more thinking about things from a kind of a optimization perspective. The procedural part is, you're looking to optimize at that point, but actually thinking about the connection and the value itself of what you're trying to do or why you're trying to do it. That's the more systems thinking approach, and that's something that's often lacking, especially in organizations, that people don't even necessarily, they're very good at operationally doing things quickly, but they're not necessarily thinking about why they're doing it in the first place. So and they may even be able to tell you how they do it, but
Right.
they can't tell you why. And so I think that there's, this pyramid I really find, and I apply it, I'm trying to apply it more and more to language and reading and in general. I'm trying to look at how, is this a why or a how or an operational statement? And when you start to be able to break it into that, you kind of see what's mechanistic, type of, I don't want to say thinking, not that that's bad, but it's more of a mechanistic approach, versus more of a holistic systemic approach. And I think this is why philosophy is so important to science in general. So Richard, how are you feeling? What are you taking away from today?
Well, good. I enjoy going back into these kinds of conversations, and I guess what I got out of the early part of the reading was the limit of what can form a closed system. I'd never really kind of thought of it that way. But then going back to some of the things that you were just saying now, when I tried to work with this idea of systemic and systematic, and I started with the tetrahedron, and I said, well, what can I do to the tetrahedron that represents both? And so the first thing that happened, if you've got the three-dimensional one, the three triangles up in the bottom one, when you fold off down the three upright ones, you get a planar picture of four triangles. And then when you separate those triangles a little bit and add the connections, the lines between, then you can see 4 and 6 quite easily. But then the question was, can I turn the tetrahedron into a systematic process? And that's when I ended up taking that same laid down flat 4 triangles, and then took the top one and rolled it over to one end or the other. And that then got me 4 lined up with each other that look like a procedural sort of step. You could have step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And so that was how I ended up being able to use the tetrahedron to turn it into a systemic sort of model, and also connect it to a systematic model, and then create a context and procedural way of trying to be helpful to somebody if you were in that kind of helping relationship sense. And so for me, it was like, I can now ground what it is I'm trying to convince people to do by way of studying a course, by saying it's grounded to nature's minimum whole system. And it's not grounded to the fact that I came up with a brilliant idea as a professor. I've actually grounded it to something that's beyond me. And then I've tried to turn it into an application that fits with the nature of my work. And that's what I found so interesting about the tetrahedron is that it can be the common infrastructure, that the minimum sort of whole system structure that I can use to help me understand my discipline and pass it on to somebody else. And you could do it with your discipline, and another person can do it with their discipline, and it all looks very different. And yet the bottom line is that we're all working off of the tetrahedron, and we're all working off of what Fuller argues is nature's minimum whole system, or whole structural system, which means what she was getting at, I guess, is that it can be enclosed, and it has some limits in terms of whether you can use triangles or octahedrons and so forth. Anyway, that's what I got out of it. It's exciting, and I'm really value this kind of discussion. So Steve, how are you, and what are your takeaways this evening?
Well, I'm really thinking that subtly, number one, I understand the interrelationship formulas fairly well. I think I've done a lot of introspection on those. I've done a lot of graphics for myself to see what's going on there, but I realize I don't understand the relationships of the 2 different formulas on that cosmographical chart. And then all of a sudden she's going to bring in Euler's formula. So I'm really looking forward to next week. And maybe we can jump into that to determine exactly what's happening. These formulas we've talked about today seem critical to the aspect that Amy Edmondson gives in her book about the fact that geometry is crud. I'm not going to remember it. It's space has shape. All structures are formed according to spatial symmetries and constraints. And as she took those triangles and squares and started sticking them together, it became obvious that there were spatial constraints. I think when most scientists go in and start doing their analyses, they come up with these formulas that may or may not have anything to do with spatial constraints. So, and I think that was her argument initially in the other previous chapter where she talks about the irrationality of pi. Why is pi irrational? The idea of these constraints. And if we start looking at the universe in terms of space having, not just space being an open thing where anything can happen, space has a certain shape, and that shape limits, it constrains, and it has symmetries to which anything that's going on in that space has to conform. I think that's profound, and I'm going to dream about what the hell that means. I'm looking forward to next week's conversation. Now, look, is next week Thanksgiving?
It is, yeah. But that
And
was
do
a really
we
good takeaway.
do we want to have it on Thanksgiving weekend?
I don't have anything going on. Well, wait a minute. What's next weekend? The 30th? Yeah, I might have some difficulty getting to the meeting. I have a meeting at night in New York. I mean, I can hop on. I might be in transit. That's the only difference.
Well, what do you think, Richard? Do you want to do it on Thanksgiving weekend? I miss our conversations, so I'm kind of open to making it happen,
Well, I've already had my Thanksgiving on October the 10th, so.
Oh, you Canadians are just totally freaking weird. You spell words weird, you say things weird, and then you have your Thanksgiving on the wrong freaking day.
Yeah.
There is no right and wrong.
What? So
no, we shouldn't be ending it right. That should have been part of my takeaway.
That's exactly right. So, well, do we want to? You've already had yours. Were you absent on your holiday, on your Thanksgiving weekend, or did you go ahead and have the discipline to attend? Do you recall?
Well, that's the other thing that's interesting. Our Thanksgiving Day is the first Monday of October. So we can't even cheat like the Americans do by calling it on Thursday, and then they just walk away on Friday anyway.
Right.
So it's
and as I recall,
you've really got it going well in order to get 4 days out of a one-day holiday.
Well, Americans are pretty good manipulators.
Yeah, exactly.
And I recall, in fact, October 10th, I went into my 10-day on October 9th.
Yeah, I was just about to bring that up. Yeah,
I wasn't even here.
So we did take off that.
Yeah, we did take off that weekend. So you can say all you want, Canadian. You blew it. No.
Yeah, you got a 5-day
weekend. We gave you an excuse not to have an excuse.
Right.
I don't know. I try to be rude, but then I get embarrassed. Okay, so we're going to have it on Thanksgiving weekend. Well, I think I'm going to be here, and Joe thinks he's going to be in transit, but he'll be here. The Canadians certainly don't have any restriction, and I think neither do the people in Malaysia.
Right.
And Australia. So let's
I'll be back by then.
Let's go for next week, and we'll see. What, Joe?
Same time.
Yeah, we're now, because daylight savings time, I screwed that up. I thought I changed the calendar, but evidently I hadn't. So I had to send out. Richard came on at the time appointed on the calendar, and so I went and modified the calendar. I moved it now to 9, and hopefully I'll have it 9 Mountain Standard, and it's the same time for Australia, ever was, and Arizona. So, and I think Africa, maybe it's an hour earlier. I don't know. I'm complete.
I don't know. It's 5 a.m. for Manil all the time. So I always remember
Yeah.
that because that's like 5 a.m. on a Sunday for how many years? I don't know. That's a lot. That's a
He
lot.
did good, didn't he? All right.
Oh my
See you all
God.
soon.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.